All right, yes, hello everyone. I'm so excited to speak with you about basic preservation practices. I am Annie Halliday, the Library and Archives Manager for the Mercer Museum Research Library. The library is located on the third floor of the Mercer Museum in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. The Mercer Museum and library are operated by the Bucks County Historical Society. The library is open to the public Tuesday through Saturday, and admission to the library is included in a museum entrance ticket or a BCHS membership. We are open to the public, but we also offer remote research services such as research by mail, document retrieval, and obituary retrieval. So even if you're not able to come into the library, we can still help you do research and have access to our collection. The library staff are devoted to collecting, preserving, and cataloging historic documents such as personal papers, diaries, ledgers, maps, photographs, and ephemera. The collection scope of the research library is the history and culture of Bucks County, the history of trades, crafts, and artifacts of everyday life before 1850, and the life of Henry Chapman Mercer. Our collection can be utilized for genealogical and property research, along with research on topics related to Mercer's areas of interest, such as the arts and crafts movement. We are also the depository for Bucks County government records dating from 1683 to the 1930s. Our work ensures these items are preserved so they remain accessible to researchers in the future. In order to do that, one large aspect of my job is assessing new donations and already processed collections for any storage needs. If you're attending this talk, then you're likely a history enthusiast, a family historian, or have a personal collection. I get asked lots of questions by researchers, donors, and even my friends and family about how to handle and store certain items. They're often worried about family heirlooms and want to make sure they're treating their historic items with the utmost care. Whenever dealing with a collection, I first perform a storage assessment. This assessment requires me to leaf through the entire collection or donation and flag any concerns. Concerns can include ripped or torn items, things that have had too much exposure to light, mold, pest damage, or damage caused by poor storage. Mitigating storage and preservation concerns differ slightly from format to format. What is required for documents may be different from scrapbooks or photographs. Unfortunately, I'm not able to tackle every preservation or storage question in this lecture, but I will absolutely try to cover the common concerns or problems I see. Before we move on, I do want to touch on some words or terms that I will be using frequently throughout this lecture. If there are additional words you would like clarification on, please drop it in the Q&A and I can go over them at the end. Often you'll hear archivists talk about things being acid-free. You may wonder why that's important. Acid is a chemical substance that can weaken cellulose in paper and cloth. Normal household paper contains acid in order to break up the wood fibers during manufacturing. Over time, this weakening causes the paper to become brittle and flake away. Acidic items are either inherently acidic or were introduced to acid through the environment. Acid-free means that the item was purposely manufactured to be free of those acids and have a pH of 7.0 or higher. Acid-free paper is typically made from alpha cellulose and are lignin-free. However, acid-free items may, over time, through the presence of chlorine from bleaching, aluminum sulfate from sizing, or pollution, lead to the formation of acid unless the paper or board has been buffered with an alkaline substance. Which leads us to the term buffered and unbuffered. Acid-free items that are buffered means that there is an additional layer of protection to stop acid from building up. That sounds like something you would want in all storage materials, but items made with animal protein should not come in contact with buffered paper. That includes wool, leather, blueprints, animal specimens, feathers, and parchment. Buffered storage materials are ideal for most of the artifacts we will be discussing today. Manuscript is a phrase that normally has some confusion around it. I will be discussing different types of manuscripts throughout this talk. A manuscript is a handwritten or unpublished document. Most archival items in our collection are manuscripts. This includes diaries, scrapbooks, ledgers, and personal papers. Loose objects is a term for items that can be found in different places, but commonly are found between the pages of a bound item. The bound item can be a scrapbook, a published book, etc. Examples of loose items are flowers pressed between the pages of a book, a ticket stub, a newspaper clipping, a calling card, or a scrap of paper with notes scribbled on it. Shown here are 2 loose items I've removed from ledgers I've processed. I love the one on the right and the fact that someone decided to save it. Processing is a common activity I do as an archivist. Processing a collection contains several steps and means that the archivist has completed an assessment of the entire collection of materials. Processing prepares the collection for publicly used by researchers. This entails creating an arrangement or organization, rehousing materials, and completing a finding aid which contains a full inventory of the collection. I just used a word that you will hear a lot during this lecture, rehousing. Rehousing relates to storing the collection. If something is donated to us in a falling apart acidic cardboard box, then I would rehouse the collection and place it into an acid-free archival quality document box. Rehousing is where archivists deal with storage and preservation concerns. The image on the left shows a recent donation of black and white negatives. These have been kept in acidic envelopes in a falling apart shoebox in a plastic tub. The image on the right shows a similar negative collection after it's been properly rehoused. The negatives are in archival quality paper envelopes and an acid-free box, which is also labeled. Interleaving means inserting blank papers in between pages of a bound item. Typically, you interleave acid-free paper to protect items from leaching acid into each other. Now that we've covered some basic terms and concepts, let's bust some common myths around archival practices and storage methods. We are going to test your knowledge, and I'll ask you some true or false questions. Please type your answer, true or false, in the chat. True or false? I should wear gloves to handle papers and bound items. This protects the materials from the damaging oil on my hands. Please drop the answer in your chat, and Elizabeth's going to let us know what kind of answers we got.
So I'm seeing mostly true with a couple false kind of scattered in. So I'm going to say 75% of people are saying true. The other 25% are saying false.
Great. Well, the answer is false. The number one myth that I commonly hear about in my work is wearing gloves while handling historic documents. I totally understand that wearing gloves feels cool and fancy and what the professionals use, but we actually don't. Research has found that gloves dull the sensitivity in your fingers and can actually lead you to damage an item more than if you were barehanded. To handle historic documents or books, all you need is clean, dry hands. True or false? I shouldn't use tape to repair torn or ripped historic documents. It's better to leave them damaged. Please drop your answer in the chat.
Okay. Ooh, this might be 50-50 true and false.
Ooh, okay. I love
maybe
50-50.
60% true.
Okay. Well, the answer is true. Most tapes are incredibly acidic and will transfer that acid to the document. Over time, the tape will turn yellow and brittle and affect whatever it is you repaired. It is also incredibly difficult to remove in the future. Repairing paper properly is fiddly work, so when in doubt, it's better just to leave it torn or ripped. True or false? Plastic bins or bags are the best way to store items. It protects items from water damage. Drop your answer in the chat.
So much false. Like, I want to say 97% false, with
Oh my God.
a couple people saying true.
Well, you're all professional archivists now because the answer is false. I commonly receive donations in large plastic tubs. I totally get it. They are easy to find, cheap, and feel like they do the job. Unfortunately, most plastics include PVC. In order to make PVC flexible, plasticizers are added during manufacturing. These compounds can damage archival materials by releasing chemical gases into the air and can break down the materials in a surprisingly short amount of time. PVC can also be found in photo pages and can seem oily to the touch and look yellow. Plastic bins can also create microclimates where humidity and temperature can build up and slowly damage items. Ironically, cardboard boxes are the best means to store items because they can be acid-free and buffered, allow things to off-gas, and better ensure the longevity of your archival items. If water damage is a concern, make sure the boxes are stored off the ground in case of flooding or are stored on shelving with a top so leaks don't fall directly on the boxes. I have some general best practices that are applicable to most archival items. They are extremely simple, but you would be surprised how infrequently people do them. My friends and family are so sick of me hearing me talk about them, but I promise they will help. Label everything. I mean everything. I talk about context a lot, but it truly is the best way to preserve your items. You have to imagine 100 years from now, when these items are handed down to future generations or donated to a historical society, what information will they need? You can't count on everyone knowing the dates of an event, where the family's summer home was, or who that person is in that photograph. Nothing breaks my heart more than an unlabeled photograph with no information about who is in it or when and where it was taken. If you can discreetly label an item with background information, those in the future will thank you. I also encourage you to write down what you know, even if it's a list of birth and death dates, a family tree, where people lived, or an important memory. That can be crucial information for a family historian or genealogist. You also want to label things in pencil or an acid-free pen, such as a micron. You do not want to use Sharpies or ballpoint pens. Pencil allows for easy updates or changes if necessary and doesn't leach into the item. Also, pencil means if you accidentally drop it onto a pile of papers, you aren't potentially leaving giant permanent marks. Most of the items you are looking to protect are currently fragile or will be soon. The best method for protecting these items is to handle them as little as possible. Every time you open a photo album or unfold a letter, you are degrading that item a little more. The spine weakens, the paper tears or flakes, and eventually the item becomes unstable. Creating digital copies of items is a fantastic way to limit handling. That way you can easily show off that beautiful watercolor your great-great-grandmother made or flip through a scrapbook with your cousins. Of course, that doesn't mean you can't look at the actual items every once in a while, but this will absolutely help cut down on how much the item degrades. You also want to provide as many layers of protection as possible. An example is a letter in an acid-free folder in an acid-free box. The box absorbs any potential light, humidity, or dust damage, which protects the folder, which supports and protects the letter from tearing or slumping. Each storage item does a different but important job in protecting your collection. Now we begin to talk through different common item formats you may have in your collection. One of those forms are documents or papers. This can mean a letter, personal writings, etc. Whenever I receive a collection of papers as a donation, I first go through all of them and survey them. I assess if there's any major damage, such as mold or pests. I then work through the following steps. I remove any metal fasteners that may have come with the document. Metal fasteners include staples, paper clips, binder clips, etc. These metal items can rust over time and stain the paper like what is shown here on the left. These can be replaced with plastic clips, which are essentially plastic paper clips. An example is shown here on the right and is sold by Gaylord Archival. They come in a variety of sizes and colors, and you can order them easily from most online retailers. Rubber bands can also damage paper items. They dry out over time, become brittle, and break apart, as shown here in the picture on the left. This crispy rubber band was wrapped around a map from our collection. Bits of rubber band pieces can also adhere to the papers they were wrapped around. I remove all rubber bands when I find them. If one has already attached itself to the paper, I use a micro spatula to gently scrape the pieces off. If the rubber band doesn't give away easily, I leave them alone. It's better not to create a tear. An example of a micro spatula is shown in the top right image. If you remove the rubber band and you still want the item to remain rolled up, I suggest using cotton string to tie the item. This is acid-free and won't adhere to the paper. I understand the instinct to save as many copies of a thing as possible. This can be an advertisement, a program from an event, anything that has been made en masse. It is not necessary to keep more than 3 copies of any identical item. I always spend some time weeding a collection for duplicates. This mostly comes down to storage space. For most of us, storage space and materials are precious, so shouldn't be wasted on storing tons of duplicates. If something is on super acidic paper, then it usually should be photocopied onto acid-free paper and the original discarded. If you're worried about losing any special qualities about the original item, you can create a high-quality scan in addition to photocopying it. Acidic paper will degrade and yellow with time. It can also leach onto other items and, quote, burn it like what is shown here. The pages of the scrapbook shown here are very acidic. You can see where the clover and the envelope have protected the opposite page from turning brown with acid. If you cannot discard the original item, then you want to interleave it with acid-free paper. We'll go into more detail on how to do that for scrapbooks in a little bit. Once these steps have been taken, you can then work on getting everything into proper housing. Documents want to be stored in acid-free folders that are then stored in acid-free boxes. An example of a typical acid-free folder is on the left, and on the right, you can see a type of document box we use here in the archives. As previously mentioned, the layers of protection help save the item from being exposed to too much dust or light. Typically, documents will fit in either a legal or letter-sized folder and document box. You want to make sure you pick the folder that best fits the item. When I'm surveying a collection, I look to see if there are going to be legal-sized documents so I know what folders and boxes to use. One important tip is never put letter-sized folders in a legal-sized box. If the folder is smaller than the box, then things are more likely to shift around and an item can slide out and get damaged or fall out of the folder and lose its context. Anything that is folded wants to be unfolded. Creases weaken paper, and when you work with older documents, you will likely see letters or advertisements that have been torn along the fold. This is why it's important to see what size folder will best fit your items. If a large item has been folded to fit into a smaller folder, then you want to upgrade it to the appropriate size. If you have a collection of letters, I recommend removing the letters from the envelopes, unfolding them, and plastic clipping it to the envelope. That way the letter can store flat, but it doesn't get separated from the envelope, which can have important information such as sender or recipient information and dates from postmarks. All folders should be labeled in pencil with clear handwriting and succinct but descriptive titles. You don't want to make the titles too long so that it's not clear what's in the folder. If you have additional information or a history around something that is being stored in a folder, then write it up and include it in the folder. A typical folder label I will create will sound like Correspondence 1915 to 1920 or Financial Documents 1989. You always want to include date information in the title. Also, don't use abbreviations. These abbreviations can be lost to time and folks in the future won't be able to understand what it means. Write out the entirety of a person's name or include any nicknames they may have gone by. Once the items are folded and the folder is labeled, then you want to put it in a box. This box should also be labeled. You can either pencil it on the front or create labels and print them off a computer. You want to make sure the box title is clear and descriptive. When I'm processing an archival collection that will be held here in the library, I assign all the collections a name such as Henry Chapman Mercer Papers or Bucks County Historical Society Records. They are also assigned a unique collection number. For your purposes, you can name the box after a specific branch of the family it covers, or it's all letters or photographs, whatever feels right. The next format we will discuss is newspapers. I often get asked about how to store newspapers. They are a great resource for information such as obituaries, marriage announcements, or if their family member was lucky enough to have an article written about them. The issue is that newspaper is famously acidic, especially older historic ones. They will become brittle and flake away over time. They also endanger other documents and can burn them. If you have newspaper in your archives, then you may have seen it leave a brown impression on other paper it's stored with. My honest opinion is that if you have newspaper clippings, I would scan or photocopy them and then discard the original. While you're making a new version of the clipping, be sure to capture what newspaper the clippings are from and the date. If you make a photocopy, write that information on the back in pencil or include it in the metadata of the digital file. Here is an example of an original newspaper clipping with a photocopy created on acid-free paper. If you really want to keep the original newspaper, Then you want to store it flat in an oversized box alone. You should remove anything that isn't newspaper from the box. If there are multiple newspapers to store, then I suggest either interleaving it with buffered paper or folder them individually. The box wants to live in a cool, dark place and be handled as little as possible. This is an item I highly recommend scanning or photocopying to limit handling. Newspaper was not built to be saved forever and will continue to flake despite utilizing these best practices. Here we are at photographs. Truly the most common questions I get asked are around photographs. People are curious how to store them properly so they can be looked at for years to come. Photographs and negatives are the one instance where you do want to use gloves to handle them. The oils from your hands can easily transfer to the photograph and damage them. If you don't have access to gloves, then hold them by the extreme edges and don't touch the surface directly. Dry, clean hands are always key. Photographs want to be sleeved individually. You can either place them in acid-free paper envelopes, polypropylene photograph pages, or polypropylene pockets. Paper enclosures, as shown on the left, will protect your photographs from damage caused by light. Plastic sleeves, as shown on the right, are clear, which makes viewing them easy but provide no light protection. If you store them in paper envelopes, then you can place them in folders or an acid-free shoebox, as shown on the left. The polypropylene photograph pages are easy to purchase. They are also designed to either sleeve a photo individually or can store multiple photographs in a page. Some are 3-hole punch, so you can place them in a binder of some kind. Again, you want to be careful with metal elements in your storage materials. You don't want them to rust and affect the item. Ideally, the binder should be archival quality, such as the one shown on the right. Gaylord Archival sells great kits such as this for storing photographs. Don't let your photographs lose their context. You can label them in pencil or micron pen on the back. You can scan them and include information in the file name. However works best for you is fine, just make sure you do it. You want to record who is in the photo, where it was taken, and when it was taken whenever possible. If you can include any family tree information, such as this photograph of Lois Wegman, sister to Frances Wegman, was taken in 1969 at our house in Brooklyn. This provides incredible context and helps illustrate the family tree. Most of us inherit or purchase framed photographs. While this is a great way to display them, photographs shouldn't be stored in frames in the long term. When a photograph is hanging on the wall, it is exposed to a lot of light. Also, most framing materials contain acid of some kind and can damage them. I recommend removing the original photograph from the frame and storing them in a box. I should mention there are frames that are equipped with glazed UV acrylic that better protects the item, but there are no guarantees that that will last forever. When in doubt, create a high quality scan of the photograph, then print and frame that. The original can live peacefully in a dark box and looked at safely every once in a while. These photos are examples of acid-free frame kits you can purchase from Gaylord Archival. There is a certain kind of photo album that was popular in the 60s and 70s that is my mortal enemy. We receive them in donations all the time, and you probably know exactly what type I'm talking about. The pages are slightly sticky and are covered in a thin piece of clinging plastic. You place the photographs on the page and then laid the plastic over them, which supposedly held them in place. These albums are terrible long-term storage for photos. The static cling that holds the images in place can wear out, so all the photos slide around the page and can fall out of the album completely. Or even worse, the plastic adheres even more over time and you can no longer safely peel back the plastic without damaging the photos. If you are able to safely remove photographs from these albums, please do so sooner rather than later. If you have received a photo album where all the photos are glued or taped down to the pages, there are a few ways to safely remove them. You can either use a micro spatula or dentifloss to slowly tease the photo away from the album page. You want to work the spatula or floss slowly between the photo and the page to break through the adhesive. This is delicate work, so don't rush it, but you could easily tear, because you could easily tear through the photo. If it won't lift up and there's nothing on the back of the page, you could always cut the photograph out so that there's still album page on the back, but at least you can store it in better housing. Bound manuscripts is a general term for things like scrapbooks, diaries, or ledgers. Most personal archival collections contain one or more of these objects. We have an entire collection of bound manuscripts here in the Mercer Museum archives. I am fortunate enough to work with them frequently. There are a few practices I recommend when storing these items for the long term. One of my favorite types of archival items are scrapbooks. Scrapbooks are an incredible insight into the creator's personality. What items they saved, how it's formatted, any fun notes they leave on the pages are all wonderful ways to learn about who made it. Funnily, archivists usually are not a fan of scrapbooks, typically because they can be difficult to store properly. Due to the hodgepodge nature of what's kept in a scrapbook, you could be dealing with several different types of items. There could be photographs, 3D objects, and newspaper all on one page. There are a few ways to handle storing scrapbooks. It's really up to you and how you want to view it that determines the best method. First, ask yourself if you want to keep the scrapbook intact or disassemble it. Whatever your decision is, I first recommend creating a complete scan of the scrapbook from cover to cover, including blank pages. This scan captures the scrapbook's original order and layout. That way, if a page falls out or an item detaches, you know what the creator originally intended. You can create the scan either using a flatbed scanner, a specially designed book scanner, or even using a digital camera or cell phone. But again, you want to make sure you do the entire thing in order. If you want to keep the scrapbook intact, then I recommend at the very least interleaving acid-free paper between each page. This paper will provide a barrier between acidic and non-acidic items attached to the scrapbook pages. The image shown here is an example of interleaving. You can see the paper has been cut to size and has been placed in between each page. If you want to give the scrapbook the best shot at surviving over the years, then I would disassemble it. That means removing it from whatever the binding is. Some scrapbooks are in binders or are bound with string, which have metal or acidic elements. They degrade over time and will usually fall apart with repeated use anyway. If you are able to safely remove the pages from the binding, then you can store the pages more easily in folders or clear acid-free sleeves. If you decide to sleeve or folder the pages, I would number them somehow so that you can store them in the correct order. But fear not, if they fall out of order, you've already created your scan to reference. One example is if a scrapbook is stored in a binder, it's inevitable that the holes will tear and the pages will be loose. Archival supply companies make acid-free binders that can hold clear 3-hole punched acid-free sleeves that fit sheets of paper. This means the stress of turning pages is now on the sleeve and no longer on the delicate paper. Journals and diaries are, of course, wonderful ways to learn about a person. Some can be boring observations about the weather, or some offer in-depth views into how a person spent their time or what they were feeling. Regardless, there's always an important insight into a person's life. These types of bound manuscripts can take many forms and are harder to disassemble. I will usually leave them as is and work on getting them into acid-free housing. You can buy a clamshell box, shown here on the left, which stores the item flat. If you go this route, you want to get a box that's as close to the size of the item as possible. Again, you don't want things shifting around too much in its housing. You want it to be snug, but not so tight it's causing any damage. If you cannot get an acid-free box with the exact right dimensions, you can always wrap it in acid-free tissue paper before placing it in the box. The tissue paper provides padding and keeps the volume in place. If you want to store it in an acid-free document box, say there are a few slim volumes you want stored together in one box, then you want to store it with the spine facing down as demonstrated on the right. This puts less stress on the item. If you put it with the opening down, then things are likely to slump and the pages can be folded or damaged. Loose objects can appear in anything such as a scrapbook, a diary, or a Bible. They are usually loose objects that have been inserted in between pages of something else. The loose item might be related to whatever is on the page of the item or have no relation at all. Some examples are ticket stubs, receipts, and pressed botanicals. Either way, you want to make sure they are housed properly and that you note where they were found within the volume. One way to do that is by noting what page it was found in between. For example, if you find a small scribbled note between pages 5 and 6 of a ledger, you want to remove the item, put it in a folder, and label the folder something along the lines of loose object removed from pages 5 and 6 of the 1915 ledger, or pressed flowers removed from the back of Elizabeth Morris's 1922 diary. That way, if what's written on the page references the ticket stub or receipt that was placed there, you can still look at the item, but it no longer can accidentally fall out or damage the paper in the volume. Shown here is a scrap of paper removed from a volume and the label of the folder it lives in. The final format we will be discussing are published volumes. Family Bibles are one type of published items that require special housing. We have a wonderful special collection of Bibles here in the library. They are a valuable resource for genealogists because it was customary to track birth and death information of family members in them. This could be recorded on either the front or end covers or in a special blank section in the middle of the Bible. We keep our Bibles in our dark, climate-controlled vault. They are stored flat on their back covers so the spines are not stressed. If you're responsible for a family Bible, I recommend placing it in a clamshell box. This is a great layer of protection and will help stave off any light damage accumulation. I recommend creating a digital version of any special annotations in the Bible. That way you can easily reference any of the important birth, death, or marriage information while limiting the handling the item. As we talked about earlier, you want to limit handling as much as possible. You always want to be sure to check for any loose or interleaved items that may be tucked between the pages. If you do find items, then note where you located them, remove them, and folder them separately. Some of you may have special published books in your collection. Those are okay to store either in clamshell boxes, laid flat on their cover, or spine down. If you have a volume, published or unpublished, with a detached cover or loose binding, you can tie them with some cotton string. That gives everything extra support or ensures no parts of the volume go missing. You simply tie the book up similar to gift wrapping a present. One thing you want to do is make sure the knot goes at the top of the volume. If the knot is on the spine or either cover, then the pressure of the string can damage the item. Thank you so much for coming to this talk on Preservation 101. I know I threw a lot of information at you, so please feel free to drop any questions in the Q&A and hopefully we can answer some.